Hello and welcome to another video review. This is ELDERBORN for PC, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was provided a review copy of this. This is a first-person melee action game by Hyperstrange that was released into early access in 2018 and saw its full release in January of last year. And while the game did originally launch with some technical and balancing issues that they gradually sorted out over patches, it has generally been pretty well received overall, though I haven't really seen all that many mainstream outlets covering the game really at all. But it's not like the mainstream gaming press not covering something is really all that much of a loss. Not that it's especially relevant for this particular video anyway. What is more relevant, however, is my prior experience with a few specific games. Namely, games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Lords of the Fallen, and to a lesser extent, Sekiro. Because the developers of ELDERBORN were quite upfront with the fact that this has Souls-like mechanics. Which means that this game is playing at a disadvantage right from the start, because I have yet to find a Souls-like game I've actually been able to even tolerate, let alone enjoy. All of the previous videos I've done on Souls-like games, however, have all been my thoughts on videos, because I've never been able to force myself to finish any of them. But this isn't a my thoughts on video. It's a full review, which means I was able to finish this particular game. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the Unity engine, and it is generally quite well done as far as things like the modeling, the texture quality, and the animations go, although there are some spotty elements here and there, like occasional textures that are particularly rough, or some of the animations being a bit janky here and there, but it's not anything that can't easily be worked around, and it also helps that the game's aesthetic tends to make up for a lot of the issues here and there with raw visual quality. They describe it as Howardian, although I don't really think that's a widely accepted term, but the idea there is that it harkens back to the likes of Conan the Barbarian. It's dark fantasy with a vibe that's somewhere between Dark Age and Iron Age, so you get some of that ancient era stuff going on, but also some more medieval aspects to it, although ELDERBORN does lean more into the ancient aspects. And it's all very in keeping with the heavy metal aesthetics that they're going for, where pretty much everything in this would be right at home in an 80s heavy metal album. Blood and gore, undead everywhere, scantily clad, ridiculously buff barbarian player characters. It's got it all, really. And that extends over into the sound design as well, especially with regards to the soundtrack, which is a heavy metal soundtrack that includes some more, as they describe it, exotic elements, which fit the dark fantasy look that they've gone for quite well. And as you might expect, when you're just wandering around and exploring things and there's not a huge amount of action going on, the soundtrack is still metal, but it's a lot more subdued and atmospheric, and when the combat heats up, they intensify the drums and guitar, so you're getting something a lot more action-packed. And let's face it, it's hard not to feel like a badass when you're chopping enemies apart with very big, heavy melee weapons, and it's playing heavy metal riffs while you're doing that. It also helps that the sound effects are fairly chunky, so when you're swinging big, heavy melee weapons around and smashing enemies against walls, or slicing them apart, or kicking them off of ledges or whatever, you feel like you're really causing some damage. But while the music kicks ass and the sound effects are pretty nice and chunky, the voice acting is just downright terrible. I have a feeling they were trying to take it in a bit of a cheesy and ridiculous direction, but they ended up forcing it a bit too much, and you end up with something that's not only stilted and unnatural, but it just ends up being kind of annoying when it does come up. I mean, seriously, just have a listen for yourself.
No one returned from the pilgrimage, yet there is no fear in my heart as I stare into the darkness. Gripping my weapon, I step into the shadows, and the shadows come alive.
Now thankfully, there isn't a lot of voice acting in this game. It really only occurs during the cutscenes, if you can really call them that. They're more like slideshows than anything else, that occur between the game's acts. So basically the intro sequence, and then after you complete Act 1, you get another one. After you complete Act 2, you get another one. And then once you finish the game and get to the end of Act 3, then it will give you another sequence where you have narration. So really all you're getting while you're playing the game normally are a bunch of yells and grunts and screams and such, and that's all fine. There's nothing really to complain about there. It's just during those cutscenes or slideshows or whatever you want to call them that narration can get pretty annoying. But apart from that, when you bring everything together, you end up with a presentation that, for the most part, actually does a rather good job. It's got a very specific aesthetic that it's going for, it pretty much nails that aesthetic, and that more than makes up for any of the issues that the visuals and sound have. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is extremely bare bones, and you barely get any of it throughout the entire game. The only times you're really going to get any story are during the cutscenes or slideshows or whatever you want to call them between the various acts. And the idea is that in centuries past, there was an ancient city that rose out of effectively a post-apocalyptic landscape and used its so-called Golden Army to subjugate any of the remaining tribes in the area, until eventually a leader arose among the tribes named Janus, who raised an army to attack the city and free the tribes from oppression. Janus and that army never returned, but the city was sealed shut, and it remained dormant for centuries, with your tribe developing a tradition upon which they will decide a champion every generation, and send that champion upon a pilgrimage to the city in the hopes of exploring its depths and uncovering its secrets, ultimately with the goal of finding the supposed treasure that lies there, which is supposed to be the secrets of eternal life, effectively. The champion is determined through trial by combat, and the game basically begins with your character entering the Forbidden Caves, which is the only way into the city at this point, in the hopes of being the first champion to return from their pilgrimage. And that's where the game is going to start. Before that, you select whether you want your player character to be male or female. It doesn't really have any major effect on the gameplay or anything. It just changes what the voice is going to be and what the visuals for your character are going to be during the cutscenes. There isn't any character customization or anything like that. You just pick a male or female player character and then you just jump right into the game. And you find out almost immediately that there's really not much going on as far as the story goes, but it does have an awful lot of lore that you can find by wandering around the areas and finding a bunch of codex entries. The thing is, all of that lore is completely optional, so if you ignore the codex entries, then basically all you're getting is, you're the champion of your tribe who goes to this city to try to find the secrets of eternal life, and then at the end of Act 1 you get the revelations that the elders were not entirely truthful about what they sent you in there for, and then by the end of Act 2 you know why they sent you there and you're not exactly happy about it. But by this point you have a new objective, and Act 3 has you carrying out the rest of that objective. And then by the time you get through Act 3 and you've had all the revelations made, you can't help but feel like the story was rushed out the door. Like it just wasn't finished and they had to wrap things up quickly, so they slapped a few things together and that ended up being the end game. A sentiment which is certainly not helped by the end game basically being one long sprint of just you fighting hordes of the same enemies you've been fighting throughout the entire rest of the game until eventually you just get to the end of it. And while the Steam page says the game is around 8 to 10 hours long, it really isn't unless you go for a full completionist run. I did a fair bit of exploration as I played the game and got quite a few of the codex entries. In fact, as I finished recording the footage for this video, I had gotten up to 77% of all of the codex entries in the game. But even though I got stuck at a certain point in the game because of an issue that I'll explain a bit more later, and wasted probably about 20 to 30 minutes on it, just wandering around the area trying to figure out what it was I missed. And even though I was kind of going out of my way to look for some of those codex entries, this thing still clocked in at less than 5 hours long. More specifically, I completed the game in 4 hours and 52 minutes if my save file is correct. Now, I have seen some people that completed the game in closer to that 8 to 10 hour mark, but I've also seen some people complete it in even less time than what I did, and be more around 3 hours long, so your mileage is going to vary depending on how much of a completionist playthrough you do, and how much of the lore entries you really start to delve into, and how much of the areas you continue to repeat. And throughout the entirety of that, the story doesn't really do much except for barely hold the game together and give you some vague direction as to what you're ultimately trying to achieve. And while those lore entries do certainly help flesh out the world a bit, they have no real impact on the game at all. You're really going to be concerned more with the gameplay than anything else. So what exactly is the gameplay of Elderborn? Well, as I said, this is a first-person melee action game with some Souls-like elements, and the Souls-like elements mainly come in the form of the death mechanic, where whenever you die in this game, you'll respawn at the last activated fountain, and then you can go back to wherever it was you died and collect whatever essence you left behind. Essence being your experience points, which gradually fill up a meter, and once you fill up that meter entirely, then you level up and you can go back to a fountain in order to spend an attribute point on any of 3 different attributes, and as you continue to improve those attributes, you will gradually unlock new skills. Things like being able to rip enemies' heads off of their corpses and throw them at foes, or being able to charge into enemies for a powerful melee dash attack. Thing is, as you'll see throughout this video, you don't really need the special abilities. They're just a bit of an added bonus to the things you're already doing in combat anyway. And the passive bonuses you get from increasing your 3 attributes of might, speed, and resilience don't really have all that much of an effect on the game either, at least none that I noticed. That said, there is one particular passive ability that is incredibly useful, which is the ability to parry projectiles directly back at the enemy that threw them at you, which is always pretty amusing when an enemy, say, throws a javelin at you, and you just parry it right back at them for some pretty massive damage. That said, you can complete the entire game without leveling up once if you really want to. In fact, the game even has achievements to that end. You can get an achievement for completing each act of the game without leveling up even once. And there's also an achievement for completing the entire game without dying, if that's something you really want to do. But chances are you're not going to be one of the absolutely minuscule amount of players who would go for something like that. Chances are you're going to be playing the game fairly normally, and that means you're going to be using the level ups on a pretty regular basis, and you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of grinding either because you really don't need to. Once you've learned the combat mechanics in the game, you don't really need to worry all that much about dying anymore. In fact, most of the time I ended up dying in the game, it was because I would get stuck on things in the environment, or the collision detection would be a bit odd, or I would just get launched into the stratosphere by some weird glitch. Not to mention moments where I would just be trying to explore an area in a way that it wasn't really meant to be explored in, and would end up either falling to my death from falling damage, or just falling into the abyss. So the leveling system really didn't play all that much of a role in the game's difficulty, at least as far as I could tell from just playing the game normally. What did play a significant role, however, were the way that the various environments are laid out, as well as the combat system. Now, the combat system is the much more important of those. So let me go ahead and talk about that. This is a melee action game, and on the surface it has some pretty simple mechanics. You have your basic attack button, which you can hold down to do a charged power attack. You have a button for some sort of defensive measure, which is either going to be blocking or parrying, which I'll explain a bit more about in a moment. You have a button that allows you to kick things. You have a button that you can use in conjunction with the movement keys in order to dash left, right, or forward or backwards. And you also have the ability to heal yourself with another button once you gain access to the healing vials. It's all pretty straightforward as far as the controls go, which means that the complexities are going to come from the way that the weapons behave as well as the way the enemies behave. And to that end, you'll start out with a basic sword that you can chop things with and you can block attacks with. It's straightforward and it works, but very quickly you'll also be introduced to a bit of complexity because there are plenty of attacks that cannot be blocked, as well as some that can sort of be blocked, but they'll still do damage to you even if you do block them. And that's where the weapon type you're using is going to be important. You see, as you continue through the game, you'll gain access to a variety of weapons, everything from that basic sword that you start with, through to dual sickles, to a khopesh, which is an ancient Egyptian style of curved sword, through to larger, heavier swords, as well as things like very large warhammers and such. And each of them has their own specific traits. Some of them can just blast straight through enemies' defenses, some of them will knock enemies reeling, some of them are lighter and faster but don't have a lot of range, some of them have more range but are a bit slower. It's a bit of a balancing act there, and one of the weapons even relies on the essence bar. When the essence bar is closer to full, it will do a lot more damage, so that's even bringing the essence system into the mix. But by and large, the weapons are going to fall into one of two basic categories. Those are heavier weapons, which are slower to attack with, but have more range and do more damage, and you can block with them. Or they are lighter weapons, which allow you to attack more rapidly, but don't do as much individual hit damage, and they will allow you to parry. The difference is that you can hold down block to continue to absorb damage, and parrying requires you to time your block in accordance to when the enemy attack is about to hit you in order to knock the enemy off balance and follow up with a powerful counterattack. As you might expect, different weapons are going to be more useful in different situations, and the parrying weapons in particular require more investment of time and effort to be able to really use effectively, because you have to learn when the parrying window is actually valid, as well as when the enemy's attacks are actually going to hit you based on their animations, or in the case of the projectiles, exactly how far away from you the projectile needs to be to where you can actually parry it. It's a pretty straightforward combat system that's fairly easy to pick up and use, but does require some effort to master, and when you have mastered it, you can basically glide through enemies, barely taking any damage if you take any damage at all, and just slicing and dicing your way through enemies like a friggin' blender. And they do a pretty decent job at gradually ramping up the difficulty as you continue to play. You'll start out fighting just basic melee enemies that are very easy to predict, but then they'll start mixing in some projectile-based enemies that throw javelins at you, which are still pretty easy to avoid and pretty easy to parry once you gain access to weapons that allow you to do that. Then they'll start spicing things up by introducing enemies that will attack you from a distance by leaping at you, or enemies that will have very rapid attacks that you'll need to figure out how to deal with. And by the time you get to the end of Act 1, you'll have a pretty decent roster of enemy types available to you. Then you move into Act 2, and they change things up on you again, where you still have those basic archetypes, but they've put some extra spins on them. Maybe the enemies attack more quickly. Maybe they attack with multiple projectiles instead of just one. Or maybe they lob fireballs at you and there's not really much you can do about those other than simply avoid them entirely, and thus you have to get in really close really quickly to prevent them from being a problem. And by and large, they've done a rather good job with that progression as well as the melee combat system itself. It rewards fast and precise timing as well as good movement, and it doesn't punish the player overly much. When you take damage, sure you take a lot of damage, but you have up to 3 uses of the healing vial, which will heal you up a significant amount, and you can replenish that by killing enemies, so as you'll continue fighting, as long as you're not making any further mistakes, you should be able to recover from previous mistakes that you've made. When everything's firing on all cylinders, even if you're going up against a group of enemies, you'll feel like an absolute badass just parrying attacks and following up with nasty counterattacks, chopping through enemies, slicing heads off, taking enemies' severed heads and throwing them at your opponents, dashing into enemies, and just carving a bloody swath through basically everything that gets in your way. And after you've carved that bloody swath through the areas that you're exploring, you'll get to the end of an act and you'll have a boss fight. Or at least you'll have that for the first 2 acts. You have a pretty basic one at the end of Act 1, and then at the end of Act 2 you'll be fighting totally not Ornstein and Smaug. Then you get to Act 3 and you fight your way through all of the hordes that you'll be going through in that, and you might be thinking that at the end of all of that you'll have one final climactic boss fight, because Act 3 is the final act of the game, but instead of getting a boss fight at the end of it, the game just ends. Fairly abruptly, in fact. And you really get the feeling that Act 3 was just rushed out the door because they just didn't really have time to finish it, or they had just kind of run out of ideas. Whatever the case may be, Act 3 is really disappointing after going through Acts 1 and 2. Because in addition to the gradual ramp up of combat challenge throughout Acts 1 and 2, The acts themselves require you to explore this area and navigate hazards and traps, going on key hunts or otherwise completing some sort of objective that will open up a new area for you to be able to explore and find new weapons and new enemy types and such in. And then after all of that, you get through the second boss fight, and then you get to Act 3, and it's just a really linear gauntlet where you're just going to be fighting the same enemies you've already fought, and they don't introduce anything new or anything really interesting during that sequence. And to make matters worse, there are no fountains during the third act, so if you've got a completely full essence bar and you were hoping that you'd be able to level up a bit more, well, you can't after the end of Act 2. It's just a really lame way of closing out the game. That said, it's not like the previous two acts don't have their frustrations either. Act 3 is frustrating by simply being a fairly lazy, uninspired, and frankly kind of boring way to close the game. But Acts 1 and 2 can suffer greatly from the where do I go and what do I do effect. To give you a prime example, there was a bit towards the end of Act 1 where you have to collect a bunch of skulls and put them on platforms to unlock a door to progress. Well, I got to the point where I had found 3 of the skulls, and I couldn't figure out where the 4th one was. So I spent the next roughly half an hour just wandering through all of the areas I had already explored several times in order to try to find this damn skull that I'd missed. And that was made all the more frustrating by some of those areas connecting to other areas that I'd already explored, and just going in there only to realize, oh wait, I'm going through this area I was just through, but now I'm backwards. And it just ended up being incredibly frustrating. This was considerably more of a problem in Act 1 than it was in Act 2, because Act 2, you've gone to the city, and the environments are considerably more open, and it's a lot easier to orient yourself towards your objectives. Meanwhile, in Act 1, you're going through a bunch of caves and catacombs, a lot of which look pretty much the same as each other, so it's very easy to get turned around and a bit lost in those. And since the game doesn't have any sort of auto-map feature or even a map at all, you're just relying on visual cues in the environment, which may or may not even be there, navigating the environments can be a real pain. And when you combine that navigation issue with some of the level design itself just being flat-out irritating, where they'll throw you into confined spaces with either a bunch of enemies or one or two very specific, rather powerful enemies that you don't really have the room to maneuver around, or they'll have you wandering through an area and it seems clear only for areas behind you to open up and enemies to spill out from them, or they will throw you into situations where you need to go along pretty narrow platforms over an instant death fall, only to have enemies in front of you or behind of you, or sometimes even both, coming at you with various projectiles that might knock you completely off of the platform or the walkway or whatever, or they'll hit you with charging or leaping attacks that you can't actually block or parry, so you have to dodge them, only there's nowhere to dodge to, or things along those lines. You end up with level design that oscillates pretty wildly between being solid and kind of interesting, and that which becomes really irritating really quickly, and there's really not a whole lot of in between there. Sometimes you'll go into one right after the other, all in the span of maybe a couple of minutes, and it just ends up being a very rough overall experience. That said, because the game is actually not very long, and because that melee combat system is so satisfying when it's firing on all cylinders, you are ultimately able to overcome the issues with the level design. It just requires more patience than you would need to expend with a lot of other games. And when you bring it all together, you find that the game does have some pretty significant problems. In addition to the ones I mentioned, there's also some weird frame rate problems here and there, where the frame rate will just randomly start tanking down into the 40s and below, and I'm not entirely sure why, because most of the game runs at a solid 60 plus frames per second all the time. And then there's some odd issues with the hit registration on parries, where you may have to start a parry either before or after you really think you should, because the timing on when the attack actually hits you is just slightly off, so I'm not really sure what's going on with that. But overall, the experience of Elderborn is a generally positive one. It's certainly not amazing. The coverage I have seen of the game has pretty wildly overhyped it compared to what you actually get, but if you're looking for a solid melee action game, then Elderborn will certainly fit the bill. And overall, it does fit in the 3.5 out of 5 category on my scale. It's a solid game that is worth playing if this is your kind of thing, although you might want to wait for a bit of a discount, even though the price on this game is actually not bad even at MSRP. It's $15 US, just base price, and about $20 if you want to get it bundled with the soundtrack and the digital art book. So even though I would normally say wait for a sale with a 3.5 out of 5 game, this game's price is low enough to where that's not really an issue. Just make sure you temper your expectations going into it. Thank you all for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.